And now I'm delighted to welcome as our guest Aileen Evans, who's President of CIH and the Group CEO of Grand Union Housing. And she'll be speaking first. And then my two colleagues, the eponymous founders of Campbell Tickell, and James Tickell, will be following her. So we'll start with you, Aileen, and if I can hand over to you to start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm very grateful. I'm going to start my presentation with a quote and a story. The first one is a quote I use a lot that says, if we want things to stay the same, then things will have to change. It was said by some Italian philosopher. And if we want the things that the sector holds dear to remain the same, then we have to change the way we do things. And I think this pandemic is an awful thing to have happened, but actually it does present some opportunities for us to do that. Secondly, there's a story about Albert Einstein, who upon being told he had set the same exam questions as he had done the previous year, said, but the answers have changed. And so I think the other thing that we've got is some new answers, or some answers that were kind of there, but not necessarily uppermost in our minds. So in thinking about this, I was and going back over it, we had quite limited time to prepare. We did do some preparation, but actually what I found was that all the things that we had done previously, for example, in testing our incident management processes, is nothing like a live test. And actually, despite the fact that we had really limited time to prepare, those things worked quite well. We made really fast decisions, loads and loads of decisions every single day, and our governance caught up. So there was a recognition that operations took precedent over governance for a while. But nonetheless, we had worried staff and we had worried customers. But broadly, as I saw it, the issues divided into two. There were people issues and there were tech and process issues. And in working through all of those, what we discovered was that there was no such thing as too much communication. It was communication, communication, communication. And in that regard, the WhatsApp group that Campbell Tickell set up was really, really useful. It gave chief execs a safe space to offload, to ask questions, to check what other people were doing, to sense check stuff. It was really, really helpful. And I think if we carry, of the things that I think we will carry forward, I would like to carry that sort of forum forward, because I think it's been really helpful. And I think actually it accelerated decision making in the sector and helped us make better decisions more quickly. So what did we learn? So we learned that good tech was essential, but it wasn't the only solution. And there were issues around that we have started to think about as we roll out more of that. The value of solid partnerships, I don't think, can be underestimated. And actually one of the things we've been able to do is cement better partnerships with people through this. We did things more quickly than we thought. I tell a story. My friend was a previous advisor to Alan Milburn and went out to New Zealand in the wake of the earthquake there as a health professional, and they accelerated healthcare practice in New Zealand in the wake of the in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake by about 15 years. They think it would have taken them 15 years to have got the innovations that they introduced in a hurry, like we've all done, in the immediate aftermath of that. People issues are really important. What did we stop that nobody missed? Well, we stopped visiting people. Apart from for repairs, we've not visited anybody, but we have put in a series of mechanisms by which we contacted older, more vulnerable people. Isn't it strange, I guess, that we've gone back to that kind of more maternalistic way of doing things? And what did we start? Well, we'd invested heavily in tech in Grand Union over the last 2 and a bit years. But even so, we rushed some of the back end of that so that we could do some stuff more quickly. Particularly, our allocations is completely digital now, including videos by surveyors of properties. We need to get a better accompaniment to those and the surveyors' heavy breathing. Actually, we could do with putting some music over that, but they're little things. And we've carried on recruiting digitally. So what do we think the lessons are? We need to use the Internet of Things much more. Fire alarms, boilers, Legionella testing. There's a whole load of stuff that people will not want us in their homes for in the future. There is going to be nervousness around getting the virus for a long time to come. And so the Internet of Things, I think, provides us with opportunities, and we had already begun to use them. We're accelerating that at Grand Union. Routine processes need automating, and we need to speed this up. I think we knew that anyway, didn't we? But making those things more accessible to customers, but also internal processes, because that crucially will free up resource, and we will need that resource. In terms of those issues, though, we've got some ethics issues to consider, I think, as a sector. Years ago, we did a big project with Oxford University around where we put a load of sensors into somebody's house with their permission to see how the renewable energy tech worked. That gave us a load of information about how they lived in their homes, not just about how the tech worked. And I think there's some issues there that we need to grapple with as a sector that I don't think we've particularly thought about. And there's clearly data and GDPR risks for those too. And how do we properly digitally enable service? Access to broadband has been an issue for us. Our customers' access to broadband. They're things that we have to solve if we want to deliver those services digitally. We can't wait for people to catch up. And in people issues, we're going to see more unemployed people. We're going to see people who, and we've found this, people accessing the benefit system for the first time that have never accessed it before. And that's been a massive culture shock for them. And that, I think, will have some political consequences too. I also think that actually we'll see a bit of the private rented sector shrinking as offices move out of big cities, as people no longer need to live quite so near work because we've all proved we can do it remotely. But as also, I think, as rents begin to fall, there'll be an impact on private sector landlords and an impact on tenants. At the moment, landlords are able to evict people thinking that they can get somebody in or pay a higher rent. I'm not sure that will be true in some places. So I'm wondering whether or not we need to think about some sort of housing market package too, for those of you who can remember the first one. But that will put greater pressure on social housing. But also, I think, you know, we all have this thing in our organisations where we think that 20% of our issues, or 80% of our issues are caused by 20% of customers or problems. That'll become 70-30 or 60-40, because I think we'll see more vulnerability, more unemployed. We stress tested our business plan last year for social unrest, and we did it in order to break the business plan. Actually, we may see some starting of social unrest if it does take 2 or 3 years to get back to where we were. As far as staff are concerned, talent has always been a challenge in the sector, no time more than now. And so we will still have those issues around attracting talent to the sector. We have to equip people to be able to continually adapt. When, you know, we talk about agile working at Grand Union, it isn't working from home. Agile is a state of mind. It's how you think about the world. And so how can we enable the people to think differently in order to cope with the speed of change that's coming? About every 6 months, we reckon major new technological interventions. We had a high stress mental health crisis before. We've had, that's not gone away. And also millennials want different things. They want work of value, of meaning and flexibility. And as employers, we need to create mentally healthy working environments. And I'd just add one thing in really about the disruptors. We had disruptors in our organisation before, in housing before, but they've got no baggage really. They haven't any of the history that we've got, so they're not bogged down with it. You know, they are simple businesses, they automate, they digitise, they've got no real physical presence, and they start from scratch, so it's easier to stay ahead. Do they even need to make money? Because actually I think the way they make money is to turn the asset at the end when they're finished with it. They don't actually need to generate surpluses through that. So we've still got those existential threats, and they operate in a completely different way. I think it's an issue that will become more prevalent and something that we need to actively consider in the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I have a question to put to you. Should we expect a rent freeze in the housing sector? So the question is, I think, from someone in Scotland, saying it would be the first time in Scotland, but obviously we have previous experience of that in England and Wales. What's your view about that, Aileen?
They froze the rents in Northern Ireland this year. So there is some history for that. I think it's something we should plan for. I think it's something that we should stress test for, and we should make sure that sorry, that's my timer going off. That we should make sure that we are prepared for that. But we've still got a whole carbon neutral agenda, for example. The carbon issue hasn't gone away. And we are just grappling at Grand Union with which levers do we pull? You know, do we pull a rent lever? Do we spend more on carbon neutral? Do we build fewer homes? What are it's the consequences of a rent freeze that I think we need to think about on all aspects of our business.
And I think the person who's asking the question is asking, should we do it before we're told to do it? So let's let that linger in the air a little bit. We'll come back to that, because I think it's you know, the sectoral responses to the crisis might be something that we want to pick up as a wider issue.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Aileen. I'm going to ask Greg now to step into the presentation seat.
Right. Thanks, Radojka. Good afternoon, everybody. Some thoughts from me on where I see the housing sector heading. Some of this is clear direction, where I think it can be discerned. Some of it is about interpreting trends, and some of it pure speculation. Inevitably, I'm going to touch on some of the areas that Aileen's talked about, and no doubt some of the areas that James is going to be talking about in a few minutes. To a great extent, many of the changes that one might expect are going to depend on how long the virus is with us. A bit obvious, if you like, but plainly, if a Donald Trump-style miracle was to appear next week and the virus disappeared overnight because we'd all been taking hydroxychloroquine or we'd been injecting ourselves with bleach, there might be a temptation to rewind back to the status quo ante in January. But of course, it won't. The virus is going to be with us in one form or another for a long time. And a lot of what happens depends on whether a vaccine is found to work and how long it takes to manufacture it in bulk and then, of course, roll it out worldwide. I've yet to hear a serious epidemiologist, and just for clarification, I'm not talking about all the new epidemiology experts who've sprung up on social media in recent weeks. I've yet to hear from a serious epidemiologist claiming anything less than 12 months to get to a vaccine that works and has been properly tested. And of course, many are saying as long as 24 months. Now, some commentators take the view that whenever we do get beyond COVID, we will substantially rewind our activities back to where we were before. I don't believe that. The key reason is firstly because the virus will be around quite a while, and secondly because people's behaviour and expectations will have changed and won't be changing back, short, I suppose, of experiencing revelations on the road to Barnard Castle. Firstly, people will have got used to physical distancing and will, at least for the time being, expect it to apply, both at work and in social settings. other than, of course, Southend Beach, as you'll have seen from the photos last weekend. Secondly, many people will have got used to working from home, and many will want to continue doing that at least part of the time. Thirdly, many people will be less keen on travelling long distances, even to get their eyes tested. In addition, many will be uncomfortable using forms of public transport, especially when it's crowded. And at the same time, people will be keen on technological solutions in many cases, because they've seen a lot of these in operation, they know they can work, and meanwhile the market is working overtime to develop more, better, faster solutions. At the same time, money is going to be tight, and that's both public money and private money, because the economy, both in this country and elsewhere, will have been severely damaged and will take a long time to recover, way beyond the sort of time frame that we anticipate the virus itself will be with us. So that's going to mean a continuing focus on maximizing value for money. We should not underestimate how much poverty is going to increase and spread as jobs disappear and government funding is stretched and then runs out, especially when one looks at initiatives like the funding of large-scale furloughing. So what does that mean for the social housing sector and for the social housing sector, not simply on its own, but as part of wider society? To start with, I believe that remote working is with us for the long term. I don't see that being absolute. Rather, it's going to be about people who can work remotely doing so, not full-time, but certainly part-time. I believe that that is increasingly going to become the norm, alongside significant reductions in business travel, so that where meetings can be done effectively online, many of them will be. Clearly, it's going to save time. It will also save money. That then means different things. It means organizations reducing their office footprints, saving money where they can, and at the same time creating space that can be put to other uses. An obvious example would be where offices can be converted into housing. That in itself could be valuable because it could, in many cases, enable new provision more cost effectively than traditional new build. Even more so, given the likely reduction in demand for office space, which I believe is going to send commercial rents and prices downwards. And of course, housing demand, as we know, isn't going to go away, but funding it will be a greater challenge in the future, given the inevitable limitations on government funding post-COVID, and given the likely reductions in housing prices over the next year and perhaps longer, which valuers are estimating at up to 10% over the course of this year, which in turn makes cross-subsidy in relation to development that much more problematic. And sort of expanding further on the subject of housing development, I believe that expectations are going to change. We all know the difficulties that some of the colleagues that our organisations have got working from home are experiencing with space. And typically it's younger people in more junior roles who are having to work in their bedrooms, on their kitchen tables, putting up with dodgy broadband and so on. I believe that increasingly in the future, people looking to buy or rent homes will be looking for more space to enable them to work remotely part of the time. I see space standards coming back. Who knows? Maybe even we'll see a return to Parker Morris. It's not just going to be about space, though. People will be looking for space within their homes. People will be looking for green space close by, places they can walk and relax. They'll also be looking for other forms of amenity in their immediate neighbourhood, shops, community hubs, and so on. As far as density is concerned in development, I believe that the ability to increase density is going to depend significantly on whether there is sufficient amenity to support and facilitate people working from home. Live-work units likely to become popular, and broadband, of course, is going to have to improve in terms of speed and stability. There will also be different types of demand. I was looking at a survey yesterday showing a huge drop in potential demand for residential care. People do not want to think about moving into traditional style care homes or residential care settings, and they don't want it for their older relations. Excuse me. No surprise given recent circumstances, but there are important implications there for how we approach the design and development of homes for older people and other vulnerable groups. I think we're going to see an increase in the use of MMC, with off-site manufacture of housing increasing steadily from the around 2% of current provision that it has been at in the last few years. Because after all, the manufacturing process is more suited to physical distancing, the build process is typically quicker than traditional construction, and off-site manufacture can be cost competitive relative to traditional construction over about 6 stories, the experts tell me. What about other areas of activity in social housing? Well, we know that some housing providers are doing online viewings of properties as part of their allocations processes. Some, such as Aileen's Grand Union, are now doing virtual sign-ups of new tenants. Traditional resident consultation processes have now been replaced by online or telephone arrangements. And I keep hearing of reports from up and down the country of residents, especially those who are vulnerable, saying they've never had so much contact from their landlord as they have done since lockdown. I can see many of those processes continuing into the future because they work and because they can be easier and often more cost effective to deliver. For example, a housing officer can reach far more residents by phone in a given time than they can by visiting them in person. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that we should be getting rid of all in-person contact with residents. There are critical areas where in-person contact is more important than ever. For instance, in relation to domestic abuse and violence and ASB, where we've sadly, but probably inevitably seen spiking of incidents over the past 10 weeks. And if there's one positive to come out of this situation, I think it's been the increased recognition of the need to address mental health and loneliness, both for residents, especially those who are vulnerable, and for staff. I also want to touch on another area where we're seeing changes, and we'll see more in the future, namely repairs and maintenance, as Aileen was referring to. You may have seen, a number of you may have seen the piece in Inside Housing a couple of weeks ago about how some social landlords, and the examples cited were Kingdom Housing in Fife, Carbon in North East England, WHG in the West Midlands, are using augmented reality technology to help tenants diagnose and carry out simple repairs remotely. Much of that tech already exists and has done for a long time. Years and years ago, I was discussing with a major telecoms and alarm systems provider how their kit could be installed into new build homes to provide diagnostic intel to the landlord when particular equipment needed repair. These sorts of systems can save time and money for the landlord, time and aggravation for the resident. Right, I will skip to my last point, which is about the local role and focus of housing providers. As people are concentrating more on their immediate local area for living and working, and as government increases devolution to combined and unitary local authorities, but without corresponding increases in funding, and with the sad, but probably inevitable disappearance of many charities, a lot of people will be turning to social landlords for help with all sorts of issues. That's a challenge for housing providers and an opportunity to build on the kind of partnership working and commitment that Aileen referred to around the WhatsApp group, and to see it extended, I think, on a continuing basis to stronger, longer lasting relationships with councils, health bodies, care providers, schools, and so on. And I think there's a lot to be gained there. So just to wrap up, in summary, change is happening, whether we all like it or not. But the critical change from all of this is in people's attitudes and expectations. We need to respond to those.
Okay, there's a few questions. I'm gonna save a couple till the end, but the one is about, should we have a radical review of repairs policy? How about stopping demand-led routine repairs and moving to twice yearly property health check for every tenant? What do you think about that, Greg?
Sorry, Rad, I lost you.
There's a question about radical review of repairs. How about stopping demand-led routine repairs and moving to twice yearly property health checks?
It's an interesting idea. It would need to be looked at in the round. Where we're looking at compliance issues, one of the frustrations among members of the WhatsApp group was around the position that the HSE was taking, where they were showing no signs of flexibility. I mean, people were suggesting that, you know, maybe the period for gas safety checks, for instance, could be extended from 12 months to 15 months. And similarly, one would need to get the housing ombudsman on board, because again, there's a sense that some of the approach that the ombudsman team have been taking is less than helpful. If it was looked at in the round and all relevant parties were brought on board, then yes, I can see merit in having that kind of debate.
Thank you. Sina, could we just show the poll from the beginning before we move on to James? So what we're seeing there is just over half of the group saying they feel optimistic about the future of social housing post-COVID. I guess sort of 4/5 actually having reasonable levels of optimism, a few unsures, and only a tiny number of people somewhat pessimistic. So we'll see whether that changes by the end. Okay, James, let's come on to you, if that's all right. And I thank you, the people posting through questions. I'm reading them as they come through, and I'll come back to some of them after James.
Right, thank you, Radojka. And nice to see so many people at this event. Much has been said already by my colleagues, but I have saved a few things that haven't already been commented on. And I think the first thing that we've learned, and a lot of this does come from the WhatsApp group that has been referred to, is that this pandemic wasn't on any risk maps. Nobody saw it coming, but even so, as Aileen has described, we've turned out to be more resilient than might have been the case. And actually, being a social landlord is a far better place to be than, for instance, a restaurant or a travel business or a theatre. So from the WhatsApp group, right at the beginning, people were dealing with the immediate consequences. There were things about gas servicing, supply chains, spares for lifts, getting personal protective equipment, wondering about the impact of arrears. Maybe there were going to be accounting issues, dealing with unsold properties and so on. So I think it was useful at the beginning for people to work out how to react immediately. But longer term, and looking back at what we've learned in the 2 months since it was set up, I think one thing I've learned is that it pushes us back to social purpose. It really is about social purpose. We've heard already about hunger, poverty and unemployment, and that is for sure. And I think that the residents of social housing will be at the sharp end, along with the people who would like to be in social housing but aren't because there isn't enough. And I think we've seen the impact of communities that have lost resilience after a decade of austerity. Food banks and other charities have been, some of them have been overwhelmed, they haven't had donations. And it's very interesting to see, for instance, that Accent Housing has come up with a fairly major initiative for food banks. And I think what I would say is that that sort of stuff is no longer a nice optional extra for a feel-good moment. It's actually core business now. That kind of direct community support for people who are really going to be hurting. I think the other thing that's become clear is that the values that we all have of favouring diversity and inclusion and working for that have become more important. It is about diverse communities, it's about valuing everybody's contribution, and again, that has moved to the front of our values. I'm pretty certain, well, I know, that the need for social housing will increase now. There will be more people who need social housing even than now. And I was reminded of a debate we had years ago. The housing association sector used to be called a movement. And then it became an industry. And I sort of wondered, well, is it perhaps going to become a bit more of a movement again? going back to that old debate. So what else have we learned? Well, as has been said, 5-year programs to move people to remote working all happened in 2 weeks, and actually they worked surprisingly well. But there are limits. Loneliness and mental health have been referred to. The problem for colleagues who don't have enough space or decent broadband has been referred to. And although it has worked reasonably well, there are some things that really can't be done. The whole work on culture, on team bonding, bringing new people on board, recruitment is more difficult but possible. And I think what people are beginning to realize now is that the future office will have a very different purpose. It isn't just about having half as many people there. It's about having a place where people go to learn, to be with each other, to work with their teams, to meet outside parties and so on. It isn't so much about the place where you just go to sit in front of a computer screen and beaver away. Similar lessons really in terms of online governance. I've heard one chief executive, and it wasn't Aileen, saying, we're never going to go back to real meetings. This is so much better. Think of the savings on biscuits. And the people have found that meetings are better focused, they're better at making decisions, there's less personal politics, maybe it's easier to stay strategic. The delegation to staff has been bold in many cases, and it's worked really well. But also, if you're sitting in front of a screen, maybe 10, maybe 20 miles away, of course you're going to be more detached, less grounded in the work of the organisation. And there is an issue about people who are just not good with technology, who are somewhat excluded from all of this. And I think my observation is that for now, we have moved our old governance online as it was, more or less. And actually, there's a whole debate now to have about a more decentralized form of governance, about horizontal governance as it's known, and perhaps looking at some of the very interesting systems like Lumio for one, that allow a very different kind of decision making online, far more participative. So that's for the future. We've heard too about collaboration and sharing, and the WhatsApp group was a really good example. If somebody needed a policy, they just had to ask, and 5 or 6 examples would sort of slot into their inbox. But I think the lesson for me is that we need to get back to embedding collaboration into day-to-day work between social landlords, large and small, local authorities, churches and community groups, and above all, actually, the whole question of rough sleeping, how to deal with the scourge of rough sleeping and the kind of partnerships that are needed to tackle that, which I see as a huge priority. What else? We've kind of heard a bit about this. Customer experience is everything. It's true across every sector. It's about, whether it's commercial, whether it's housing, whether it's anything. And success in the future will depend on integrated experience, hassle-free, one step. And new operating models are emerging, the kind of reimagination of the operating model system. They're not there yet, but it's going to look different. And I suppose at its simplest, and we've had an example of this already, processes need to fit the customer, not the other way around. And that is a little bit of a revolution in our sector. Frontline staff know best, another important lesson. We've heard a lot of talk about heroes, and I would say that some of the frontline staff of housing associations and other housing agencies are among those heroes. They're in touch with residents. They're far more diverse than actually upper management and boards typically. They know what's going on. They know what works. They know what doesn't work. And I think the future is going to be about management moving to more receive than transmit. Greg has mentioned care homes, and it goes beyond that. The care home sector was in crisis already. I think there are something like 400,000 care home beds in this country, and about 30% of those are in small, rundown, uneconomic care homes that have been at risk of closure for some time. And the crisis that's happened will accelerate that. At the same time, we live in an aging society, an existential question really for many of us. So there is a separate question there about where are older people, where are vulnerable people going to live, and what kind of support are they going to need. So to finish up, I think there's a few big challenges that we all need to think about. The first one is building on the change that has happened so far, driven by the crisis, to create real long-term change, new operating models, new ways of working with residents, frontline staff, customers, and so on. There's the challenge of embedding collaboration with all sorts of external agencies. And it's not just about going to more meetings. In fact, meetings probably are a necessary evil, but not the way that real collaboration happens. Homelessness, I've mentioned. We must tackle the scourge of rough sleeping and homelessness and be seen to do so. We need to develop new homes at pace to meet the new needs that Greg referred to. And I think there's a kind of sector challenge about getting support for what we do. The government we have is not instinctively going to love not-for-profit housing association type enterprises. Their instinct is going to be otherwise. And we have to create that real momentum for social housing, for people understanding the social purpose. The G15 in London have set up their Homes for Heroes initiative, harking back to 1919. That kind of momentum, the climate of opinion behind social housing is something that we have to create. So yes, it's been difficult for many. It's heartening to see so many optimistic people. I'm optimistic too. Hosts are not allowed to vote, so I didn't. I do think it's going to be a struggle, though, to make sure that the optimistic future does happen. It's not going to fall into our laps. It's going to be a long, hard struggle to make sure that social housing really can carry on delivering as it has. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. There are a few sort of strategic, systemic kind of questions about housing provision, and I wonder if we can sort of roll them into one sort of general consideration. So one of them is around, you know, how do we get to having more social housing? And another one, there were a couple of questions about homelessness, about the new homeless, young people, where family breakdown has happened during lockdown. But also we've seen different interventions, haven't we, around rough sleeping. What is it that needs to, so I think the question is, what is it that needs to change to shift the problem of homelessness? You know, is there anything we can take from what's been happening? Is there anything that the sector could be lobbying about differently? I don't know. A question to all of the panel. And what is it that needs to change if we're going to have more social housing? You know, how do we get to that place? Everyone seems to be saying, and we've heard it from at least one of the panelists, that we need more real social housing. How do we get there, and how optimistic are we that we can get there? So can we start with those ones around sort of housing provision, first of all? Who'd like to start? Aileen, shall I come to you first, maybe?
Yeah, I think the change in public opinion towards social housing has begun. But I think it's got a lot further to go, and I think actually what we need, and I think those opinions will change even further as more people's relatives who can't afford to live in the private rented sector because they've lost their jobs, they will. That will begin to change public opinion, and I think that's the issue. We need to change public opinion. Because if we can change public opinion, then that's what will happen. That's what will be reflected ultimately in the ballot box. I noticed there was a question about, and in terms of ending homelessness, I came off the board of Milton Keynes YMCA 2 or 3 years ago, but have supported them for a number of years and supported them through them being part of the consortium at Grand Union to provide a new 200-bed YMCA in Milton Keynes. Those major developments have all but stalled, and actually I think what we need to do is to showcase the ones that are working and the ones that actively support. The ethos of the YMCA in Milton Keynes is very much about supporting people into work, and the whole transition through the scheme is around making that happen. And so I think showcasing where it works and showcasing where it works well, I haven't seen any rough sleepers on the streets of Milton Keynes. I used to pass 15 or 20 on the walk from the station. They've all gone. We need to keep them all gone, but that isn't just about providing housing. It's about providing the range of support services that enable them to sustain good housing. And I'm not sure there's an appetite for that yet.
Okay. Greg, from your perspective around housing provision, what do you think needs to change? And I see that there's another question about area renewal activity. Would that help people stay in their existing housing rather than go into care and be part of making homes green and meeting carbon targets? I mean, there are a whole bunch of strategic questions, aren't there, about the future provision of housing? Some of them about crises that we knew about before the pandemic, as it were, but the pandemic has sort of sharpened the inequalities, sharpened some of the gaps in provision, and sharpened people's appetite for something different potentially.
This is a subject for a whole excuse me, for a whole webinar in itself. Some quick thoughts. I mean, around homelessness. Local authorities have the principal responsibility to, under the Homelessness Reduction Act, certainly affecting England, to deal with people presenting as homeless, but they don't actually have additional funding to enable them to do that. It needs effective partnership working. It needs government investment, and there was a statement yesterday about homes for homes to prevent people going back onto the street. It's not just about the provision of homes. Crucially, it's about the provision of support for people who might have been living on the street in some cases for years. They will not easily or quickly transition to managing a tenancy in the way that others who haven't had that experience will do. It needs new forms of investment from additional sources. There is, in my recent experience, the potential for a lot of new investment from the commercial sector, from institutions, in line with the ESG, environmental, social and governance agenda. As far as housing provision generally is concerned, affordable or indeed social housing provision, there is a major issue around the costing of that. In order to make it work, you need cross-subsidy. As I said before, cross-subsidy is problematic when you've got a falling housing market falling in value. You need government grant. That's problematic when the government's spending all the money that they've got available on shoring up the economy. There are two key areas on which I think actually it would require legislation, but there would be a lot of cross-party support that could make a significant difference. One is around an effective program for the release of public land without requiring full market value, which the Treasury expects to be obtained. And secondly, around land value capture, to reduce significantly the crucial area in any development of the cost of the land itself, as well as the availability.
Okay, James, I want to come to you around some of the sort of cultural questions that are coming through in the Q&A. So one is about how governance is changing, and if we're enabling those delivering services to influence strategic decision making, how can our governance reflect this? There's another one about sort of, what's the effect of this crisis on tenant engagement? And a sort of third about, is this the opportunity to really reshape our business? I'm going to mute myself while you start to answer those.
Yes, thank you. As I said, I think at the moment, our traditional governance has moved online, and it needs to carry on evolving. In terms of tenant participation and tenant engagement, yes, the mechanisms are there, but they too are, if you like, the old-fashioned ones that often depend upon a relatively small number of people turning out on a damp evening to talk about local priorities. And there are these exciting new forms of participatory governance that are online. that are being experimented in kind of networks of co-ops in New Zealand and Spain and Italy and so on. So I think there's a whole kind of looking at what is happening in other sectors, learning and making it work for us. So I think that will be important. I noticed somebody has mentioned that the Together with Tenants initiative by the Federation has been put on ice. I think we have to accept that the Federation, because of conference income and so on, is having to tighten its belt very considerably. I don't think that would be, I wouldn't want to take that as an indication that they've abandoned their commitment to Together with Tenants. I just think it's a pragmatic reaction. So I do think that it is for each organisation to experiment with things that work, that pull in a wider number of tenants, that build on these contacts that Greg mentioned, of people saying, well, I've never had so many contacts from my landlord before. So I think there is a prize there, but it isn't going to happen by turning the old traditional forms of engagement into a kind of just sort of shoehorning them into an online format. That really won't do the trick.
Does the panel see this as an opportunity to reshape businesses and organisations? I think some of that has been dripping through some of your answers, but let's just address that head on. And if I could ask that to each member of the panel, what are you seeing as unique about this space, if you like? Aileen, I'm going to come to you first and then to Greg and then to James.
We have changed our operating model and we're in the process of moving to a new operating model before the pandemic struck. And actually, what I have seen has confirmed that we were moving in the right direction. That it is about making sure that the people who want to get hold of us easily without any hassle, get stuff done, or find ways to be supported to do it themselves, can get that really easily, but the more difficult, complex cases get dealt with really well. And rather than have silos in organisations where one person deals with that aspect of a problem and somebody else deals with another aspect, then joining that up and having a case management approach, I think, is a really valuable way of looking at that. I have long said that benefits and money advice support should be part of landlords' core business. One of the things that we do, which I don't think is widespread, is we do benefit and benefit appeals. So where we support our tenants to appeal those benefits where there's been an issue. I think that's becoming more and more core business, and actually where we've put resource in this pandemic is into that team and into that kind of case management approach. So yes, I do think that it is about what are the new answers to the issues that people are facing. Some of those are technological, and some of those are how we use our people resource to address the issues we're facing, rather than have a historic way of doing something because that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah. Greg?
Given the level of change that people have gone through in a relatively short time, and have shown that they can do it, I'm tempted to say, if not now, when? Don't wait for the next crisis, because there will be another crisis. And whether it's another pandemic, or whether it's climate change related, or whether it links to the economic environment, I would say that now is the time to be having those kind of discussions, working out what are we here to do, how can we ensure that we can provide the support, the services, the homes that people look to us to provide. How can we ensure that we are robust long term? How do we move from managing and identifying and mitigating risk to being long-term resilient organizations? I would say have those discussions now. I mean, I'm not going to pretend for a minute that it's easy, because the change is happening week by week. But we have gone through the first few weeks where it was all about, it's all hands to the pump. Now we are in a comparatively stable period albeit given those changes. It's the time to have those discussions. I would say don't wait another 6 months. There'll be a new reality.
Okay, and James?
Yeah, well, just very briefly to follow up on those observations. We are going to be in transition for maybe a year, maybe 2 years. The people talk about the new normal, which is becoming one of those irritating phrases, but I think we know what it means. But the real stable new normal will not be with us for quite a long time, not until there's a vaccine or a treatment or whatever. So we're going to have 2 years of relative uncertainty, of kind of making do, of new arrangements. There may be other crises related to this. The 1918 flu epidemic had 3 waves that went around the world. So we don't really know where this story is going to end. I am certain, though, that successful organizations at the end of it will look astonishingly different to where we started 2 months ago. We will look back and think of, we won't think of the good old days, we'll think of almost the Stone Age. Well, that's how we used to do stuff. You know, we really believed that it was important for people to go into an office. We accepted that it was normal for people to be sleeping on the streets. We accepted all sorts of restrictions that actually turned out to be in our own minds. So this whole theme of transformation, of reimagination, I think it's really important for people to seize that and run with it. The answers will not be apparent immediately, but they are within our grasp.
Just picking up on that point of the adjustment that we've had sort of continuing for a period of time. I noticed that one of the questions is about parents and childcare, and in a way the pandemic has thrown up for anyone who's a manager or a leader, attuning themselves to the diversity of their team and their needs in a way that's sharper than it was before the crisis, I think, really understanding people's personal circumstances. How do we see that as employers? You know, what kind of support or approach do we take to this you know, really difficult sort of plate spinning exercise in some households around trying to both be responsible parents and be responsible employees? And certainly there's been a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, I think, around that theme and about the difficulties of it and the stresses and the strains. Aileen, I'm sort of looking at you first of all, just because you're sort of nodding sympathetically, I think.
Yeah, well, as a parent of 12-year-old twins who have been homeschooling, that's been a very real issue for me. But also I chair the governing body at the Children's Old School, and I would very much doubt that we will be having children back in school full time before next year. We might get some part-time. We might get some part-time back in September, but with the need to socially distance. There are going to be fundamental impacts on children's education, but then there are also going to be fundamental impacts on the ability of parents to work, or the ability of what we need to do as employers, I think, is value all the talents and think about how we can use those in a way that fits in better with people's home circumstances. Because if we want that diversity in our workforces, and that diversity brings huge amounts of benefits, then for the foreseeable future, or the foreseeable short-term future, those people will have some significant challenges in doing what they did before. And so as employers, actually, we need to think about how that will work in the long term, because my primary school isn't going to be opening full time in September. We'll be lucky to get 2-3 days a week for children going into it. I suspect the same with my own children. And whilst my Latin and my geography have improved, I am not the best educator of why I send them somewhere else. And so I think there are some challenges around not just about staff flexibility, but also around accepting that working days might be different shapes, that there might be some reduced hours for a while. There's going to be a whole load of issues. And actually we need to make those individual. That has to be an individual solution for those people.
Greg, just thinking about the sort of recruiting and onboarding of employees, I think we had a question about, attracting talent from outside the sector, but I think there's probably a wider question there, isn't there, about, how do we recruit effectively in this environment? Is some of it simpler actually? Are there ways of some aspects of recruitment being a little bit more straightforward? How do you see that picture as someone who runs a business that includes a recruitment arm? How do you see it changing into the future?
Well, I think in practical terms, it is perfectly possible to do recruitment, not exactly as normal, but there was a bit of a debate on the WhatsApp group the other week. Somebody said, are people proceeding with recruiting executives? And a number of the CEOs from other organisations, about a dozen of them, all came in and said yes, they were proceeding. The technology on the whole had worked. They'd been able to make the transition. There was a concern expressed by one chief executive that he liked to see the candidate's shoes at an interview. But I think it was accepted that you can't have everything, and realistically, in the present environment, we can't wait until we're in a different place to enable a return to old style recruitment. Similarly, as far as onboarding is concerned, if you can do all kinds of business meetings, including board meetings and so forth, via online systems, there is no reason why one can't do that with inducting new staff. It isn't perfect, it isn't ideal, it isn't forever, and ultimately it's probably true to say that it's not a substitute for face-to-face engagement. But given that in one form or another, as we've discussed, the current circumstances are going to be with us for quite a long time, we cannot wait however long it might be, a year, 2 years, to go back to previous arrangements. And some of it, I think, frankly, will stick. Do we really need to be dragging people down for interviews from different parts of the country, in order to assess their suitability?
So we're near the end. A quick question to all of you. If we want to give our attendees some encouragement, and we were giving them some advice about how not to waste this thing that's landed upon us that we wouldn't have wished to have, but nevertheless we're experiencing it, and some of it will have been particularly difficult for anyone who's had people die or suffer. But the people on this call are probably leaders and managers and need to go away with something positive and practical. What advice would we give them? What would we say? Go away from this and think about X or do this. Let's end on a kind of upward trajectory. James, let's start with you.
Yes, I think our North Star, and it's come out through the discussion today, is equality. It's about equality for people in communities that have been badly affected. It's about making sure that the gains of the last few years in terms of access to the workplace are not lost. And there is evidence that single parents, working couples, young women are being discriminated against in employment markets for the reasons we've discussed. It's about equality of access to jobs. It's about equality in the way we behave, in the way we respect diversity, listen to tenants, listen to frontline staff, and so on. So I think that if we can hang on to equality, social purpose, and the values that we've spoken about, but actually now have a chance to make real, that has to be the way forward.
Okay, Aileen?
Don't be worried about failure. Try stuff, fail quickly, move on.
Brilliant. And Greg?
Don't try and go back to the old. The old is not going to return. We're in the new. We've made enormous changes. All of our organisations, all of our staff, all of the people that we work with. Let's celebrate and embrace that. Let's give the people who've been on the front line and working on these issues throughout organisations from top to bottom. Let's give them the recognition and the support that they deserve.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much for our attendees as well for your questions. Tried to get through as many of them as I could. Oh, fantastic. Our somewhat pessimistic participants have either left or changed their views. So I'll take that as a positive. So thanks, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm sure we'll probably be surveying you just to kind of, take a pulse check on your opinions about how this worked for you. But thanks very much for coming along. So that's the end of the meeting. We're going to close it, and thank you.